When we left Molly Hackabout, we knew that she was in trouble, because not only is one of London's recognizable madams about to seduce her, but a Lord Chartres, C-H-R-T-R-E-S, who is the assistant, the henchman of Robert Walpole, the Prime Minister, is there. Now, Hogarth was a portrait artist, and so you can be sure that the faces you're looking at are the faces of people who are immediately recognizable. You see, these are people he saw in London, and people whom he could, whose faces he is trying to imitate. Now, these engravings are from an inferior engraver. If you look at Hogarth's original engravings, they're far, far more sophisticated than what I'm showing you here. But this is an old book, and it's one way of getting to the material. Let's look at the second drawing. When she is enticed into a life of prostitution, she is found in very handsome quarters. Notice she has paintings on the wall. Actually, one of the paintings is Jonah looking at Nineveh. That's one of the paintings. The other painting is David sending Bathsheba's husband back into battle. His name escapes me for a moment. Someone knows it. Someone in North Houston? Someone in West Houston? Remember, Bathsheba's husband, David seduced Bathsheba, and she was pregnant. And because he didn't want to admit that he was the father, he called Bathsheba's husband back from the battlefield and said, "Enjoy your wife for a few days." And her husband was such a noble captain, he said he would not enjoy entertainment while his men were still on the battlefield. So David sent his captain back to the battlefield with a note saying, "Put this man in the front lines." And he was killed. And so David had Bathsheba to himself. Well, anyway, these two are the paintings in this drawing. And you know what Hogarth is saying, that this is immoral conduct. And here is Molly Hackabout. Look at her riches. She's got fine curtains, draperies. She has a black servant, meaning that she has a certain degree of wealth. But what happens here is kind of interesting. And I'll zoom down into this so we see it. Apparently, she has been taking in clients without her pimp knowing it. And he's very angry with her. So he's pounded on the table, breaking a magnificent Queen Anne table. A table like this was sold at an auction for Robert Walpole's Houghton several weeks ago for about $500,000. But this is an elegant table. He's smashing the table. Notice once he smashes the table, there are pieces of pottery falling off it. You see? And her expensive animals, a monkey and a dog, are rushing away. This, of course, is a sign of the breaking of virginity. And she has lost her stature. She's lost her fine place. She's lost her holdings. And we find her next in Drury Lane, which is the theater district. And you'll see the furniture is not nearly so nice. Here she is. You don't have a fine Queen Anne furniture. Instead, you've got an old wooden chair. You don't have a monkey, as she had in the other one. You've got an old alley cat. But here she is with her faithful servant. Here she is with her faithful servant. And in this particular episode, the sheriff of Middlesex County came in to arrest her. And his face is obvious. People say when this came out, Parliament, someone rushed in and said Molly Hackabout is being arrested, and Parliament cheered. There's no sympathy with a harlot in the 18th century. And they dismissed Parliament so people go out and buy copies of their engravings. Here is a picture of the famous highwayman Macheath. who appears in the Beggar's Opera. By the way, this is a very sad day, and I'll show you. Look at this curtain here. You see this curtain here? Watch the knot. It should be a sad face. The original drawing actually has this face with the mouth turned down. This is not as good a drawing as it should be. But at any rate, Molly Huckabout is going to go to prison. And you'll see Bridewell Prison in just a moment. This is the kind of prison that Moll Flanders would have found herself in. This is a workhouse. And what they're doing is pounding hemp. They have hemp, which is a plant, pounding it to turn it into fiber for clothing. And here's Molly Huckabout pounding the hemp. People, when they were led to the gallows, would be dressed in hempen outfits. This would be the last garb they would wear. And here's Molly Huckabout. There's a man here who's also pounding hemp, and there's a card, a playing card at his foot, showing that he's in there for gambling. Here's someone who's in the stocks, you see. Here's someone who's in the stocks. His hands are held up there, and the sign says, those who sin stand thusly. Notice that this is one wall. This is where the wall of the workhouse ends, and an addition continues, indicating that in the 18th century they were expanding their prisons as we are expanding our prisons in Texas in the 20th century. The wooden ceilings, these are a couple of prostitutes who have finished pounding hemp because their bag of hemp is up here on the table. Molly Huckabout gets out of jail, but she is still a young girl at about the age of 19. She is suffering illness. Here she is sick and dying. Here is her son, little boy, a bastard child, trying to heat food over the fireplace. Here is an old woman rummaging through her case, trying to see what kind of clothes she can steal. Here is a lawyer and a doctor, and the only question is whether the doctor is going to give her enough pills to get well or enough to kill her. We're not sure. There's poor Molly Huckabout. You see her son, little boy, is just worried about eating. Here's Molly Huckabout dying. Here's the same woman who assisted her at Drury Lane. And the doctor with his pillbox, and either a lawyer or a landlord trying to figure out how she's going to pay her rent, and this old woman foraging for her. Finally, we have the death scene where Molly Huckabout has died, and she's in her coffin. Just a young girl. Notice what's in the background there. The hat of innocence, right? There's her little innocent hat. Women are at the funeral. One commentator says that these are the virtuous women of her trade. These are other prostitutes. And here one is actually looking and crying, weeping over Molly Huckabout. Here one is pouring wine into her coffin by mistake. He's knocked over a wine glass. Here one man is already making an assignation with this woman. during Molly Hackabout's wake. You see this one? This is her maid, who's really the only one mourning, because here you've got the clergyman apparently who is somewhat affectionate toward the woman here. And there is Molly Hackabout's little son dressed for the funeral. Well, that is the Harlot's Progress, plate 6. And we'll stop at this point and move into Moll, Flanders. Now, you've had a chance to read Moll, Flanders, and I hope you may have some questions, and perhaps people at West Euston or North Euston. Any voices there who want to say hello?
We're here now. Can you hear us?
Yes. How many are there?
There's 3 of us at West Houston.
Oh, well, I always enjoy. The only thing I regret this semester is not driving out to West Houston to be with you, because it's a nice drive, especially when you go through the Barker Reservoir around 6:15 as the sun is setting, and you get that magnificent sun on a land that will not be built up, I guess. So thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to speak, and it's good hearing from you. Moll, Flanders, as I've mentioned, was written in 1722. And the story some of you are familiar with. Moll, Flanders is born in Newgate Prison. And her mother is transported to America, whereas the child is taken away from her. Women who were confined to Bridewell Prison and Newgate Prison were likely to be hanged unless they became pregnant. Numerous women became pregnant in jail, and then their lives were spared. At 18 months, Moll, Flanders, without a family, is first befriended by a band of gypsies who desert her in Colchester. Then the child is in charge of the parish. By the way, there never has been a time when there haven't been poor people. People taken care of by the parish, people taken care of by the state. As we learn in debates going on today, there are people in the world who would like, people in the country who would like a world to exist without the poor and without orphans and without children who have little future. But we may not solve the problems in the 20th century, since they didn't solve them in the 18th century and they didn't solve them in biblical days. The best we can do is find ways to handle them so that people are treated with respect. And that's one of the concerns that Moll, Flanders has. In the parish, she becomes the favorite of the wife and daughter of the mayor. And she is flattered and she receives attention. Now, one of the problems with Moll, Flanders is that she becomes somewhat vain. And this is a sin, and this is one of the reasons she finds herself in trouble. But when she's 14 years old, Moll, Flanders again finds herself without a home. And when her instructor dies, she's desperately concerned that she doesn't want to go in service. She wants to be a lady. She wants to learn how to sew. She wants to learn how to be creative. But she doesn't want to be a common maid in service. And she's desperately concerned about that situation. She's then taken into a household where Moll seems much more talented and much brighter than the daughters of the household, though she hasn't the wealth or the place. There, when she's in the household, she is attracted, or the eldest son is attracted to her and finally seduces her. not only does he seduce her, but he gives her a sum of money and a reward, which she is somewhat embarrassed to take, but takes anyway. Now, she's no less a whore and loses her virtue no less severely than if she did not take the money. But taking the money only suggests that she realizes that if anything is to occur with these liaisons, she had better benefit from them.
Excuse me?
Yes.
When they said that she wanted to be a gentlewoman, is that what the sewing and all that was about?
Yes, she doesn't want to clean floors. She doesn't want to be in the stable. She doesn't want to take out chamber pots. She wants to be a person who can teach children, who can knit and sew, and who has a better place in the household than a common scullery maid. Right. Thank you for the question. Now, having been seduced by the older brother, there's some promise that he is going to marry her. But of course, the laws of primogeniture suggest that it's the older brother who's going to inherit the property and who's going to inherit the wealth of the family. And under no circumstances would the older brother ever marry a girl without position, without family, or without any economic ties. It just would not happen. And not until, remember, this is 1722, not until Richardson writes Pamela some years later, in 1739, do we have a serving girl who resists the advances of her, the man of the house, and who, having resisted, is then rewarded for her virtue by marrying him. That's the novel. That's the novel that was sensational. It swept England, Pamela, and they claimed that 1 million women learned to read just so they could read Pamela. And then the rest of the novel was spent in Pamela in the husband, Mr. B, trying to persuade his family that Pamela was worthy of them. But that was a long time off. By the way, it wasn't so many years ago that I was in Scotland, where I heard of a family that was working on the estate of a wealthy laird, and he demanded that one of the girls come to work in the house, and she didn't want to. She wanted to go to college. And because she refused, and her father could not make her come to work in the house, the laird dismissed the whole family from the estate. And these were people who made their simple living off the estate as tenant farmers. And when you leave such an estate, you have no tools, you have no implements, you have no way of making a living. So even in the 20th century, in the Highlands of Scotland, in some places, family and scullery women are treated as scullery maids. They may not elevate their position, they may not improve their position, and they have to listen to what the laird tells them to do. Well, in this case, Moll Flanders finds herself in the unfortunate position of being a whore to one brother, she says, and a wife to another. But she marries Robin, and they have children, 2 or 3, 2 children. But when Robin dies after 5 years, Moll Flanders has no ties with the family, and she is forced to leave. The children are taken over by the family, and Moll Flanders is out on her own. Next, she marries a linen draper. Excuse me for one moment. I've got something here. Okay. Right. She marries a linen draper. Again, a short marriage, but it leads to her first crime, where she tries to steal from him. Another venture in matrimony was with a sea captain. She marries a sea captain and then moves to Virginia and there discovers to her embarrassment that this sea captain is the son, her half-brother, of the woman who was her mother who had moved to America. So she finds herself marrying her half-brother. And now we see, not only do we have a woman who has become a whore, but she's involved in the crime of incest. Later on, we'll discover that she is also involved in an adulterous relationship. And once you have lost your virtue, and once you move from one relationship to another, then instead of repairing your sins, you become ever more ingrained in them. And the question is how one receives salvation after getting involved in these situations. After 8 years in Virginia, she returns to England and goes to Bath, where she becomes acquainted with a man whose wife is demented. Moll helps him, becomes his mistress, and then finds himself with her child. During the 6 years in which they live together, she gives birth to 3 children and saves enough money to support herself. When the gentleman, realizing that he is engaged in this adulterous relationship, becomes self-conscious, guilt-ridden, and chooses to leave her. Next, she meets a banker whom she carries on a mild affair with, but then she comes into a rather interesting situation. She meets the man who is really her partner, and that is Jemmy, a gentleman of Lancashire who is set up to win her because he thinks she's a woman of wealth. And she's pretending to be a woman of wealth so she can win him, thinking he's a man of great wealth. And when they both marry and then discover that each has pulled a scam on the other, they realize how skillful they are, they realize their compatibility, and of course they separate. Moll, in the meantime, can return to her bank clerk, but not for about 8 months because she's discovered herself pregnant with James' child, and consequently she has to divest herself of that child before she can go back to her clerk. Now, she has a woman, a governess, who can take this child off her hands. And the child is taken off her hands on the premise that she will be taken care of as long as she lives. Now, for most of us, we would say, that's wonderful. This little girl is going to grow up, this child is going to grow up to maturity, and she'll always be taken care of by this loving family. But the implication, of course, is that she's not going to live long, that this woman who takes the child from Moll Flanders will probably kill her. So that if she's going to be taken care of as long as she lives, it won't be for long, and it won't be at great expense. Now that is the silent implication of such actions as these. And you realize, of course, that Moll Flanders is moving from one crime to another, and each is getting worse. When she meets the bank clerk again, they marry, and Moll Flanders finds that her Lancashire husband is nearby. He's getting into trouble. She rescues him from this trouble. We're going to talk more. We're going to talk more about these episodes when we move into the story next week. But Moll lives with a banker for 5 years until he dies. And at his death, she sells her property and finds herself at the age of 48 with 2 children, at which point she begins her real life of crime. She steals a bundle from an apothecary shop, and then she steals a necklace from a little girl on her way home. Those of you who have read it, do you know what feeling she has when she steals that necklace? At first she says, I could have killed her. And there were situations in novels, in stories, where we do know of girls who were seduced and then killed. It happens today too. But Moll Flanders reconciles herself to the realization that this child will now have learned a lesson. And her mother will be much more careful about leaving her by herself. So Moll has actually done a service to her society. Moll Flanders then sometimes disguises herself in men's clothing. And she becomes, as we understand, one of the most famous and richest thieves in all of England. She becomes a woman of disguises. She moves from men's clothing to beggar women's clothing, even to Quaker clothing. But finally she is arrested while trying to steal some silk brocade and finds herself imprisoned in Newgate, where, to her amazement, she finds Jamie too, who has been imprisoned along with her. Now, at this point, we get the impression that Moll has undergone a real reformation. She realizes the crime she has committed. She realizes that she may be hanged. She realizes that now is the last opportunity for her to repent or to die. And as she watches fellow prisoners being carried away in carts, and by the way, the first essay in the Norton edition of Moll Flanders has a very long account of how people are led in these carts from jail to an inn where they can get a glass of port or wine while dressed in hempen clothes, and finally left to the gallows, where they are hanged and allowed to hang for an hour, says the author of this particular piece, which is a contemporary version of a contemporary piece to Daniel Defoe. The women are allowed to hang between heaven and hell for an hour, just to show people that your fate can leave you in limbo if you're going to suffer these crimes. By the way, Defoe talks about in one of his books, and it was common for pickpockets to be hanged and for their friends to come to the hanging picking pockets all the while. Rather than deter them from the crime, seeing their fellows hanged, they found it a challenge to celebrate their fellow by proving to him that they could still ply their trade and give him due honor for his own success to the moment he was hanged. Being repentant and being persuaded by the priest, being repentant, the guards and the jailers give Moll Flanders her freedom to be transported along with Jamie. And on the ship, Moll Flanders uses her influence to bribe the captain to give herself fine quarters, finally arriving in America, where she finds herself stocked with tools and materials to enable her to run a plantation in the New World. 42 days after leaving Ireland, they arrive in Virginia. Now, I'm not sure that 42 days means anything. I'd like to say that the analogy to the Israelites wandering in the desert 40 years may be akin to Moll Flanders sailing for 40 days. And perhaps we could work that out some way. It would be an awfully nice analogy if you could, but you may not be able to. Once ashore, Moll finds out that her mother has died, and her brother, whom she had married, and her son, his son, possibly her son by him, are still in America. Well, one of the problems is that she doesn't want Jamie to meet any of these people. And so Defoe, again, with his very interesting capability to keep plots moving along in the most unique narrative, with fine narrative speed, comes up with his new plot, whereby Moll Flanders has to find a way to prevent Jamie from learning of her relationships in America prior to his arrival there. Consequently, she arranges for transportation to Chesapeake Bay, and where they plan to sail. But the ship is overloaded, and they decide to stay in Maryland, where they set up a plantation with 50 acres of land. Moll then arranges to meet with her son, and she learns that her mother had willed her a plantation on the York River with stock and with servants. She returns to Maryland, where she and her husband become wealthy planters. All the while, she knows she has this other property. How this manifests itself, how it works out, we'll talk about next week, because the way in which Defoe is able to manage these particulars, these affairs, only indicates that he himself knew how to handle business affairs, knew how to manipulate business affairs, knew how to circumvent major partners in business affairs. And even though it got him in trouble when he was dying at the age of 72, it allowed him to write a novel extricating Moll Flanders from her various predicaments. At the age of 70, Moll returns to England and there resolves to repent for her sins. And one of the things she does in repenting is to write her autobiography. So what we have is Moll Flanders writing her adventures. Now, one of the unique things about Daniel Defoe is his ability to get into the mind of his characters. And we're going to talk in a few moments about what essentially these characters are supposed to do in this novel. Because I've mentioned to you already that Daniel Defoe's concern is saving souls. This is the concern of the dissenters. This is the concern of anyone who considers himself a fideist or herself considers a fideist. So that Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress is essentially a spiritual journey and a spiritual story. Moll Flanders is what we would call a spiritual autobiography. And George Starr has written a book called The Spiritual Autobiography, in which he discusses the various relationships and attitudes of Daniel Defoe. Now, a spiritual autobiography means that a person is going to start out with certain problems, suffering certain sins, and then is going to perhaps repent of these sins, only to backslide, as Christian was concerned about in Pilgrim's Progress. And then the greater virtue is not the first discovery of one's faith, but the recovery from one's backsliding. This becomes the real mission of the spiritual autobiography. Now, we ask ourselves, what are the sins that initiated the spiritual autobiography of Moll Flanders? Well, one, of course, shall we say, her mother's sin of being jailed when she delivered the child. Now, since we know of no husband, since we know of no partner, we assume that Moll Flanders is the consequence of an illicit relationship. Probably because she was born in prison, and possibly of a liaison in prison itself. We must assume that there was no one who could lay claim to the child other than the state, and that's why the mother would sail to America without the child. First of all, on a long voyage, the child would die. So I'm going to say that her first sin was being born to a sinful mother. Now you may say, well, that's terrible. A child should not be held responsible for the sins of his mother. And a parent should not be responsible for the sins of the child. That may be so in today's world. But I would venture to say that in the 17th century and the 18th century, not only was a bastard child at a loss because of the relationship, but it's unlikely that the child could have ascended to any other position or a superior position in society because he had no place, no position, no family, and remained a bastard all his life. So to say that one of the sins is the sins of the mother is simply to recognize reality in the 18th century, and Moll Flanders would always be the woman, the bastard child of a Newgate prisoner. However, we discover that Moll is also a victim of the sin of pride. As she's growing up, she wants to be better than her position. Now, the fact that she is born of an illegitimate marriage means that her position is a low position. No matter what household she moves into, no matter what position she takes, she can never rise beyond her status. Her desire to do so, her desire to gain fame, her real belief that she can move into a family and own the primogeniture that the husband would own is pure delusion. It's not going to happen. Nevertheless, she wants to better herself. And so we have a situation where Moll Flanders is going beyond her capability and her capacities. George Starr tells us that in contemporary sermons, the argument was offered that a parent should take good heed never to try to educate the child beyond her own capabilities or her own level of understanding. Now, these are ministers who may not be willing to accept the theories in education that John Locke was offering, or the theory that people can rise and move into an upper class. But it doesn't happen in the 18th century very often. We do see some instances, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. Now, if Moll Flanders is the result of this illicit birth, which is a sinful birth, and always then becomes the progeny who reminds one of women's sinfulness in the world, her vanity then aggravates and exacerbates this terror. Moll Flanders has these strange delusions that people can actually love her who are in an upper class. Gold has its place, but if you inherit it, it's one thing. If you earn it, it's another thing. But you cannot move from one place to the other. Now, once Moll finds herself in this situation of deluding herself, then she finds herself less likely to resist the advances of the older brother. You see, if it occurred to her that nothing would ever come of this, then she might say no. Although that would be, most people would say that a working girl in an 18th century upper level household would never be allowed to resist the advances of the son of the house or the proprietor of the house.
Dr. Rothman?
Yes.
When she was living with those people, was she considered like a daughter or a servant, or how did they look at her?
They probably consider themselves as being a family who could save a soul. And by taking her to church and by bringing her up as a gentle woman, they felt themselves virtuous and honored by it. But of course, they would not have considered her part of the family. Under no circumstances would she have inherited any of their wealth, nor would they have been inclined to give her any. Although we do have cases in the 18th century of families that brought in servants that made sure that they had some independent wealth when they left so that they wouldn't be forced into servitude. We do know, for example, that Samuel Johnson was very much concerned that his black servant, Frank Barber, would not be sold into slavery if Johnson died. And so Johnson left enough money that Barber could be independent when Johnson himself died. But I don't think that they would have ever brought her into the family, nor would they have married her off to anyone of their acquaintances who may have become enamored of her. They would have known the differences. We just have to understand that the class system, even today, is a very strong one in England. Incidentally, My Fair Lady, which many of you have seen, essentially tells that story. Liza Doolittle is brought out of the slums and is educated because Higgins only wants to prove that he can take someone from the slums and turn her into a lady. But once the experiment is proven, he has no more use for her, and he simply wants her to go back to the slums. Well, in the meantime, she has gotten the taste of this fine life, and she becomes incensed that he's going to treat her like dross. And that's when the conflict and her independence manifests itself. Moll, of course, discovers what her real place is. She's a whore to one brother and a wife to the other. Now, if she's going to live up to her role as wife, then she somehow has to have to ignore her relationship with the older brother. This becomes somewhat hard to do because she is really in love with him. No question about it. He may have been in love with her, but there's no telling what has happened to her. And this is one of the problems of reconciliation. Moll reflects in various times of her life about how she should behave. Should she have slept with the older brother? Should she have maintained her innocence with the younger brother? Later on, we discover that when she's with the clerk and has accepted his proposal, she weeps. She knows that she has been dishonest. She knows she has not been repentant. She knows she has been with Jamie, that she has delivered a child unknown to the clerk, that she comes into this marriage having deceived him, that she is dishonest, and yet her repentance is mitigated by her desire to be a gentlewoman, to maintain her existence. And so each time we find her in a situation where she repents, where she feels remorseful, where she thinks, and we think she might be saved, she nevertheless moves into another situation where she ultimately must prove herself. Now, one of the points that we discover is that whatever is reasonable is not the guide for her fortunes. She's not a woman of reason. She would like to reason everything. She would like to say, I ought not marry the younger brother since I've had an affair with the older brother. She would like to say, I ought not go with the clerk, but how else am I going to maintain myself? She would like to say, I'll stay with Jamie, but then neither of us can support ourselves. She'd like to come up with all kinds of reasons for doing the right thing. But her sinfulness lies, and part of her spiritual journey lies in the fact that her passions always overwhelm her. she cannot say no in situations where she is likely to gain some independence, some wealth, or some freedom. Even at the fire, when people are running out of the house and someone says, "Here, please hold on to this plate for me," thinking that she's in the household, and she walks away with this fine plate, she could have stayed. She could have done the right thing. She could have turned the plate over to the people whose home was on fire. But here's another opportunity where Moll Flanders, by virtue of her passion, her desire for her own self-interest, is unable to say no. Now, every situation in which she finds herself steels her further against a spiritual solution. In fact, from the time she first feels that she wants to be not a maid but a gentlewoman, she's always on this trip to get what's in it for herself. In fact, for most of this book, she is steeling herself against virtue, rationalizing her actions, and benefiting at every point she can from the circumstances that present themselves to her. And then, of course, when she discovers that she is not only a good thief, but the best of thieves, not only a woman who can steal, but a woman who can steal better than any man can steal, then her pride takes over again, and she reverts back to her youth when pride is what motivated her to get herself into this situation. And so the spiritual autobiography is how a woman who is a prideful figure can in fact reconstitute her life so that she can gain virtue. Now, we understand that when she finally goes to jail and she's finally in Newgate, she realizes as she looks back on her life how many opportunities she had to say no when she could have said yes. Now, this doesn't prevent her from exerting bribes on the ship, from deceiving her husband in America, from making a secret pact with her son, from hiding her wealth from her husband, Jamie. All of this is part of the necessity of moving about. And I'd like to take a few moments now talking about the problem of necessity in Daniel Defoe's works. George Starr has written about the aspect of spiritual biography. But Maximilian Novak, who's at UCLA in the 1960s, wrote an article, and I don't have the exact citation here, 1961, I believe, 63, called The Problem of Necessity in Defoe's Fiction. He was concerned about what necessity meant. Now let's talk about necessity. Necessity, says Robinson Crusoe, makes an honest man a knave, and if the world was to be the judge according to the common received notion, there would not be an honest poor man left alive. There would not be an honest poor man left alive. Now, what is the nature of necessity? Necessity is a state of desperation, where a person who finds himself starving or destitute has to choose between life and death, between honoring the laws of society or violating the laws of society. Now, most writers would look at the art of self-preservation. And Defoe seems to have felt that in situations of necessity, the choice made is to survive. Now, I've already told you what his life was like. Daniel Defoe, without question, is a survivor. In the most desperate moments, he chose not to commit suicide, not to take his life, which would have been the end of his soul, or the damnation of his soul, not the end of his soul, but the damnation of his soul. He always knows how to survive, and his characters know how to survive. It's interesting that Robinson Crusoe is one of his survivors. H.F. in the Journal of the Plague Year is one of his survivors. Captain Singleton and Colonel Jack are survivors. But his women are equally strong survivors. Moll Flanders in this novel, and Roxana in 1724, which is a quantum jump in literary technique and a novel that does not end happily. Moll Flanders ends with a novel in which a woman, we believe, we're not told explicitly, kills her child or has her put to death to prevent her situation from being known and her true identity from being told. Now, the idea of necessity assumes that when people are desperate, their worst nature will take over. They will steal. They will seek for their self-interest. In other words, there is some evidence that the Hobbesian psychology prevails in a situation where necessity rules. Now, in Moll Flanders, she, of course, is a child without a home. She's taken in by gypsies who desert her. She's taken care of by a mayor who shows her the good life. She goes into a home where she feels she's going to be treated morally. She is rewarded by the older brother who gives her money, who gives her comfort, who gives her his love, and then who gives her his younger brother. But in all situations, what she's deprived of is security. What she's deprived of, and her deprivation lies in her insecurity. But not until she is put out of the household and now has to support herself for the first time do we find her in such straits that she doesn't know how to survive. And at this point, whatever she does becomes part of the doctrine of necessity. Now, what are some of the things she has to do? When the linen draper dies, she removes valuables from his apartment before creditors can claim them. Now, Defoe may have done some of this. When he bought the civet cats, he promised to pay £850 for them, but he only paid $200 and borrowed the rest. And then when the project failed, he had no money to return. So, to some extent, Defoe knew how to play a scam. And here, Moll Flanders has no compunction about removing the valuables and keeping them for herself before those who own them should lay claim to them. So the doctrine of necessity has now moved in, where Moll Flanders has to survive. And under the circumstances, many philosophers of the period, certainly many writers, would not consider her to be doing anything more than following nature. There are certain natural properties that people follow, and one is survival. And the law of survival is more important than the artificial laws established to maintain property. Property is paramount in the 18th century. No one will deny the efficacy of property. You've got to have property if you're going to survive. But Moll Flanders without property is going to get it. And it's understandable. If she is caught, of course, she would be jailed and may be hanged. There are at least 125 separate crimes for which a person might be hanged in the 18th century. Moll moves into the mint. She doesn't want to be seen. She knows how to mix in, and she finds herself in an area where the criminal element is generally found. She marries her brother and goes to America. And there, of course, they survive. Now what happens? To what extent are the laws of necessity about to maintain themselves? Here she is living comfortably in America, finding herself married to her half-brother, the son of her mother. Necessity might say that she should stay with him, but her morality, her higher moral code, suggests that she cannot live with this incest. And so she forgoes this comfortable relationship, albeit returning to America with a good sum, to England with a good sum of money. So she can survive, and she does make a moral judgment here. And so early in the novel, we really recognize that she has the capacity to make a right judgment. But to what extent will necessity rule her? Moll finds herself in Bath with a man whose wife is demented, a man who lives with her in sin. Now, why wouldn't she live with her brother, but she's willing to live in an adulterous relationship? Because incest is a far more heinous relationship than an adulterous relationship. And Moll Flanders is governed by the doctrine of necessity, but not by the doctrine of immorality. We're not going to call her immoral. We're not going to call her unmoral. We're going to call her the victim of necessity. And as she acquires wealth, however, the necessity grows less of a rationale. All right, what's going to happen there? The great necessity is doing what is honorable. The moral position is doing what is honorable. And there are people in the 18th century, among them Shaftesbury, Lord Shaftesbury, Francis Hutcheson, and others who claimed that virtue and truth were more important to man than his desire to preserve life. However, the argument is that there is a state of nature which prevails among all that is common. Now, it's the state of nature that Hobbes celebrates, that a 17th century philosopher by the name of Samuel Pufendorf advocates, that and a 16th century Dutch philosopher by the name of Samuel Grotius also advocates. Let me give you those names again. Samuel Pufendorf lived from 1632 to 1694. He was a German jurist who was a resident to the King of Sweden, who advocated laws of natural law. The natural law prevailed. This was also a viewpoint of Samuel Grotius, who was born April 10th, 1583. Grotius lived before Puffendorf from 1585 to 1645. And both of these figures believed and argued the doctrines of self-preservation. Whatever the circumstances, man would ultimately find a way, and in this case, of course, women, would find a way of preserving themselves against adversity. Incidentally, I'd like to say, and I think you may agree with me, that Defoe is deeply psychological in these novels. He seems to understand the very nature of survival. He gives us very strong women in situations not uncommon to women of the 18th century. He takes us away from the romances and figures of people who are involved in the high life and gives us the story of people who would otherwise be in the slums. He seems to be sympathetic with adversity. He seems to recognize that the laws of nature prevail and the law of necessity is paramount. The problem is when necessity no longer prevails, when the woman has all she needs, why does she need more? Why, when she has enough wealth, does she keep involved in her criminal action? And I maintain that what we lose sight of in suggesting that she must somehow divest herself of natural law and necessity governance is that she has no family. She has no security. She has no atomic family. She has no nuclear family. She has no family who will reach out to her. And she possibly cannot reach out to her mother in the New World because even though her mother knows she's alive, the nature of her birth would embarrass her mother. It's very possible that the son born to her mother and others born and the grandson born to that son may not be aware that their mother, their grandmother, was a felon in England who had been transported to America and who had illegitimate births. Let's never forget the fact that Moll Flanders, even though she may have great wealth, is never without protection, is never with protection. She's always the victim of a disassociated and illegitimate birth. All right. At this point, we've been going for quite a while, and I've first of all talked about Defoe. Then I gave you some examples of Hogarth's drawings of a woman of a harlot and a woman of pleasure. I've mentioned the law, natural law, and the law of necessity. We've gone over certain basic principles of this plot, and we're going to continue our discussion of Moll Flanders next week when I expect to demonstrate the gripping nature of this novel by again enunciating the Greases and the manner in which Moll Flanders is going to address these issues. At this point, I'd like to make another statement about this first critical paper. You may write about the first, second, or third part of any of these works, but I would like you to focus on one of the Greases. You may, if you wish, talk about the importance of government in this section, or the discussion of religion, or the economic values. You may wish to talk about art and aesthetics, in which you discuss Defoe's art, Defoe's capability as a writer to tell a story, his narrative excellence, his ability to take a character like Moll Flanders and give us enough detail so that we seem to know who she is, even though she is chimerical. By chimera, I mean she's almost a phantasm. Once you see her in beggar's clothing, once you see her in fancy clothing, once you see her in a governess's clothing, once you see her in the clothing of a thief, once you see her in the clothing of a lover, you see her in so many different ways. She's really chimerical. We're not sure whether we're really seeing Moll Flanders. And as you know, in the novel, she may walk down the street, and because her identity changes, even people who think they know her don't know her. And she purposely disguises herself so that even the thieves don't know who she is. So what you have is a woman capable of disguise, but the truth of the matter is that all of us have masks. When you walk into this classroom, you sit here as serious students, and I look at you and I say, this is marvelous to find all these people willing to absorb information. Most of you have read the novel. You have questions that animate this discussion. And then you go out and you go over to the Black Labrador and you have a few drinks and you lose your reason and become passionate, you see. That's your other mask. Then you walk into your office as a worker and you're a supervisor. You take on the mask of a supervisor. And your co-workers don't know that you're a student here and that you like some port wine elsewhere, or that you enjoy a good Coke or something less radical, or that you like Cutty Sark, good raspy scotch, instead of that bourbon-type scotch that most people drink. So you've got different masks. And then when you go home and your son says, Mom, I was expelled, I was thrown out of school today. And you look at him and you say, you rapscallion, you. You'd like to think that he was not of your progeny. And then you become the irate parent and you put on another mask. Inwardly you say, oh my God, I did that when I was a youngster. And you're about to laugh like the Dickens, but you can't do it. You can't laugh because you've got to show you're serious, you see. So you put on your serious mask, and behind it you're laughing. You say, boy, that kid, he's just like his old dad. Or he's like his daddy, or he's like my grandfather was, or something like that. You draw your relationships, and you put on your masks. So each of you has 3, 4, 5 different masks you wear in a given day. By necessity. Hopefully the mask is always an honest mask. I mean, you're not just, although I'm sure some people are. You put on a mask for people because you know that's what they want to hear. And so that becomes your casuistic mask. So I think you can, of course, relate to Moll Flanders' identities, but you cannot relate to, perhaps not all of you, and some of you can relate to Moll Flanders' hysteria. There's always this hysteria she suffers, and that is the hysteria of feeling what may be if she loses this money, loses this man, loses this situation, can't go back to the place where she has stored her wealth, loses that. She's always in a state of hysteria, and I think that's perhaps close to Defoe's life. He always found himself in an insecure position where he either lost his position, lost his holdings, lost his business, lost his security, lost his reputation, lost his family, and had to keep restoring it. There's a certain hysteria, and it manifests itself in his writings, yes.
Do you think that that was similar of most people during that day and age, or just specific to Defoe?
Well, I'd like to think that most people do not live in a state of hysteria, in that they have more security. I think if you have a family, and I think if that family is concerned about you, then whatever circumstances may cause you to suffer, you at least can fall back on someone who will say, okay, honey, come on home and let's sit down and talk. Or I don't want to hear from you, but don't make sure you keep in touch. You know, don't let me know your problems, but keep in touch. You may even get that, but you still have someone around. What do you think?
Well, I think that maybe during that time frame, things weren't so secure. I don't know, maybe I'm being naive to think what it was like back then, but, you know, I was just trying to think if he was, you know, the popularity of this book had to be because people's lives and fortunes were so uncertain.
Well, they were to an extent, but, you know, we're far more immobile. I think Alex Toffler in Future Shock years ago said that in any 5-year period, 35 million Americans move. Now, in the 18th century, people did not move. Certainly, most people who are poor probably never even traveled more than a mile from their homes. So you're always in an area you are familiar with. You're always with some family that could protect you. And if your immediate family was not available, your uncles, your aunts felt an obligation to take care of you. I would say that people probably had a more secure feeling in the 18th century than we may have today, where you might be with your family and then your job takes you 250, 300 miles away, and you're the only one in this town who knows you and your family. If you want to go to family receptions, you've got to travel 250 miles, a whole 3 or 4 days, you see. If something happens, your neighbor has to come over to help you. If your child gets sick and you can't come home from work, whom do you have to call? Fortunately, you may have a best friend, or you may have the landlord, or you may have a renting agent who will run over and see what the problem is. I would say that we're probably more insecure than the 18th century. They had neighbors whom they knew, and the neighbors would look out for them. And the whole idea, of course, of trial by your peers is that these peers who tried you weren't people who met you for the first time in court. They were people who knew you and your family. And so when you were there, they knew that you should have learned something and you didn't. And you didn't obey your family, and so perhaps now was the time for you to learn your lesson. Trial by your peers meant people who knew you and your family, not indifferent people selected at random by their driver's licenses. Well, it's a good point. And maybe we have other sociologists who would argue against that point, but I'd venture that people felt more secure. Most people felt more secure because their families were close by, and they didn't travel far away from them. Well, yes.
One problem I'm having with Moll and getting really to know him is that the kid thing. How could she not? She just keeps giving up all these kids, and as a mother, I mean, it makes me think that it's because a man wrote the book. And you can't just keep passing off these kids. It's like ripping out part of you. I mean, and they never mention that. Why? Do you know why? Or it's driving me crazy. And you guys are talking about it too. Everybody's counting on the kids. Where are all these kids?
Mm-hmm. If Defoe believed in adult baptism, then the children weren't important because they weren't yet settled. Their souls weren't settled. Their physical beings weren't settled. In the 18th, Locke, of course, begins to make us think that children are important. But for most people, children were simply wild and untrained and inarticulate adults. And so that their loss or their presence was of little consequence. What's important is what you became when you became older. Now, that's too callous, you see. There are instances. There's a famous writer, George Crabbe, later in the century, who talks about orphans who were picked up by Peter Grimes to work for him, and they disappeared silently. And after a while, the neighbors realized that Peter Grimes was killing these orphan children whom he had working for him, abusing them, brutalizing them. and so there was some concern for children. But one example you may have is Gulliver's Travels, where Swift tells us that because the Lilliputians believe that most children are born in concupiscence, just by people cohabiting and having a good sexual affair and not even concerned about the children who came out came from parents who really didn't know how to raise them, didn't know how to care for them. And so in Lilliput, all children are taken away from their parents at birth and given to caretakers to raise them properly. Swift, in the Modest Proposal, is concerned that there are too many starving children in this world. The 18th century is not a century that shows sensibility toward children in the sense that you're concerned about. But I think what you can do is, our time is up, but what you can do is investigate, do some research. One thing, you know, what you might do tomorrow or this week is go to the databases on this campus and just go into the sociological database, the psychology database, and the 18th century database, and hit 2 words, children and 18th century, and see how many articles come up that talk about what happens to children in the 18th century, and then you'd have a nice research paper. Thank you.